Chapter 9. A Discovery and a Chase. The supper was ready laid. The chairs were drawn round the table. Bottles, jugs, and glasses were arranged upon the sideboard, and everything betokened the approach of the most convivial period in the whole 24 hours. "Where's Rachel?" said Mr. Wardle. "Aye, and Jingle," added Mr. Pickwick. "Dear me," said the host, "I wonder I haven't missed him before. Why, I don't think I've heard his voice for 2 hours at least. Emily, my dear, ring the bell." The bell was rung, and the fat boy appeared. "Where's Miss Rachel?" He couldn't say. "Where's Mr. Jingle, then?" He didn't know. Everybody looked surprised. It was late, past 11 o'clock. Mr. Tupman laughed in his sleeve. They were loitering somewhere, talking about him. Ha ha. Capital notion, that. Funny. "Never mind," said Wardle, after a short pause. "They'll turn up presently, I dare say. I never wait supper for anybody." "Excellent rule, that," said Mr. Pickwick. "Admirable." "Pray, sit down," said the host. "Certainly," said Mr. Pickwick, and down they sat. There was a gigantic round of cold beef on the table, and Mr. Pickwick was supplied with a plentiful portion of it. He had raised his fork to his lips, and was on the very point of opening his mouth for the reception of a piece of beef, when the hum of many voices suddenly arose in the kitchen. He paused, and laid down his fork. Mr. Wardle paused too, and insensibly released his hold of the carving knife, which remained inserted in the beef. He looked at Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick looked at him. Heavy footsteps were heard in the passage. The parlor door was suddenly burst open, and the man who had cleaned Mr. Pickwick's boots on his first arrival rushed into the room, followed by the fat boy and all the domestics. "What the devil's the meaning of this?" exclaimed the host. "The kitchen chimney ain't afire, is it, Emma?" inquired the old lady. "Lor, Grandma, no!" screamed both the young ladies. "What's the matter?" roared the master of the house. The man gasped for breath, and faintly ejaculated, "They have gone, massa. Gone right clean off, sir." At this juncture, Mr. Tupman was observed to lay down his knife and fork, and to turn very pale. "Who's gone?" said Mr. Wardle fiercely. "Mr. Jingle and Miss Rachel in a po'chay from Blue Lion Muggleton. I was there, but I couldn't stop 'em, so I run off to Telly." "I paid his expenses," said Mr. Tupman, jumping up frantically. "He's got £10 of mine. Stop him! He swindled me! I won't bear it! I'll have justice, Pickwick! I won't stand it!" And with sundry incoherent exclamations of the like nature, the unhappy gentleman spun round and round the apartment in a transport of frenzy. "Lord preserve us!" ejaculated Mr. Pickwick, eyeing the extraordinary gestures of his friend with terrified surprise. "He's gone mad! What shall we do?" "Do?" said the stout old host, who regarded only the last words of the sentence. "Put the horse in the gig. I'll get a chase at the lion and follow him instantly. Where?" he exclaimed as the man ran out to execute the commission. "Where's that villain Joe?" "Here I am, but I ain't a willin'," replied a voice. It was the fat boy's. "Let me get at him, Pickwick," cried Wardle, as he rushed at the ill-starred youth. "He was bribed by that scoundrel Jingle to bet me on a wrong scent by telling me a cock and bull story of my sister and your friend Tupman." Here Mr. Tupman sunk into a chair. "Let me get at him!" "Don't let him!" screamed all the women, above whose exclamations the blubbering of the fat boy was distinctly audible. "I won't be held!" cried the old man. "Mr. Winkle, take your hands off! Mr. Pickwick, let me go, sir!" It was a beautiful sight, in that moment of turmoil and confusion, to behold the placid and philosophical expression of Mr. Pickwick's face, albeit somewhat flushed with exertion, as he stood with his arms firmly clasped round the extensive waist of their corpulent host, thus restraining the impetuosity of his passion, while the fat boy was scratched and pulled and pushed from the room by all the females congregated therein. He had no sooner released his hold than the man entered to announce that the gig was ready. "Don't let him go alone," screamed the females. "He'll kill somebody." "I'll go with him," said Mr. Pickwick. "You're a good fellow, Pickwick," said the host, grasping his hand. "Emma, give Mr. Pickwick a shawl to tie round his neck. Make haste. Look after your grandmother, girls. She's fainted away. Now then, are you ready?" Mr. Pickwick's mouth and chin having been hastily enveloped in a large shawl, his hat having been put on his head, and his greatcoat thrown over his arm, he replied in the affirmative. They jumped into the gig. "Give her head, Tom," cried the host, and away they went down the narrow lanes, jolting in and out of the cart ruts, and bumping up against the hedges on either side, as if they would go to pieces every moment. "How much are they ahead?" shouted Wardle, as they drove up to the door of the Blue Lion, round which a little crowd had collected, late as it was. "Not above 3/4 of an hour," was everybody's reply. "Chase 'em 4 directly. Out with 'em. Put up the gig afterwards." "Now, boys," cried the landlord, "chase 'em 4 out. Make haste. Look alive there." Away ran the hostlers and the boys. The lanterns glimmered as the men ran to and fro. The horses' hoofs clattered on the uneven paving of the yard. The chaise rumbled as it was drawn out of the coach-house, and all was noise and bustle. "Now then, is that chaise coming out tonight?" cried Wardle. "Coming down the yard now, sir," replied the hostler. Out came the chaise. In went the horses. On sprung the boys. In got the travellers. "Mind, the 7-mile stage in less than half an hour," shouted Wardle. "Off with you." The boys applied whip and spur. The waiters shouted, the hostlers cheered, and away they went, fast and furiously. "Pretty situation," thought Mr. Pickwick, when he had a moment's time for reflection. "Pretty situation for the general chairman of the Pickwick Club. Damp chase, strange horses, 15 miles an hour, and 12 o'clock at night." For the first 3 or 4 miles, not a word was spoken by either of the gentlemen, each being too much immersed in his own reflections to address any observations to his companion. When they had gone over that much ground, however, and the horses, getting thoroughly warmed, began to do their work in really good style, Mr. Pickwick became too much exhilarated with the rapidity of the motion to remain any longer perfectly mute. "We're sure to catch him, I think," said he. "Hope so," replied his companion. "Fine night," said Mr. Pickwick, looking up at the moon, which was shining brightly. "So much the worse," returned Wardle, "for they'll have had all the advantage of the moonlight to get the start of us, and we shall lose it. It will have gone down in another hour." "It will be rather unpleasant going at this rate in the dark, won't it?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "I dare say it will," replied his friend dryly. Mr. Pickwick's temporary excitement began to sober down a little, as he reflected upon the inconveniences and dangers of the expedition in which he had so thoughtlessly embarked. He was roused by a loud shouting of the post-boy on the leader. "Yo, yo, 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 yo!" went the first boy. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" went the second. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" chimed in old Wardle himself, most lustily, with his head and half his body out of the coach window. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" shouted Mr. Pickwick, taking up the burden of the cry, though he had not the slightest notion of its meaning or object. And amidst the yo-yoing of the whole 4, the chase stopped. "What's the matter?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "There's a gate here," replied old Wardle. "We shall hear something of the fugitives." After a lapse of 5 minutes, consumed in incessant knocking and shouting, an old man in his shirt and trousers emerged from the turnpike house and opened the gate. "How long is it since a post-chaise went through here?" inquired Mr. Wardle. "How long? Ah! Why, I don't rightly know. It weren't a long time ago, nor it weren't a short time ago. Just between the two, perhaps." "Has any chaise been by at all?" "Oh, yes. There's been a chaise by." "How long ago, my friend?" interposed Mr. Pickwick. "An hour?" I dare say it might be," replied the man. "Or 2 hours?" inquired the post-boy on the wheeler. "Well, I shouldn't wonder if it was," returned the old man doubtfully. "Drive on, boys," cried the testy old gentleman. "Don't waste any more time with that old idiot." "Idiot?" exclaimed the old man with a grin, as he stood in the middle of the road with the gate half closed, watching the chase, which rapidly diminished in the increasing distance. "No, not much of that, either. You've lost 10 minutes here and gone away as wise as you came after all. If every man on the line as he has a guinea to give him earns it half as well, you won't catch the other chaise this side Michaelmas, old short and fat." And with another prolonged grin, the old man closed the gate, re-entered his house, and bolted the door after him. Meanwhile, the chase proceeded, without any slackening of pace, towards the conclusion of the stage. The moon, as Wardle had foretold, was rapidly on the wane. Large tiers of dark, Heavy clouds, which had been gradually overspreading the sky for some time past, now formed one black mass overhead, and large drops of rain, which pattered every now and then against the windows of the chaise, seemed to warn the travelers of the rapid approach of a stormy night. The wind, too, which was directly against them, swept in furious gusts down the narrow road, and howled dismally through the trees which skirted the pathway. Mr. Pickwick drew his coat closer about him, coiled himself more snugly up into the corner of the chaise, and fell into a sound sleep, from which he was only awakened by the stopping of the vehicle, the sound of the hostler's bell, and a loud cry of "Horses on directly!" But here another delay occurred. The boys were sleeping with such mysterious soundness that it took 5 minutes apiece to wake them. The hostler had somehow or other mislaid the key of the stable, and even when that was found, 2 sleepy helpers put the wrong harness on the wrong horses, and the whole process of harnessing had to be gone through afresh. Had Mr. Pickwick been alone, these multiplied obstacles would have completely put an end to the pursuit at once. But old Wardle was not to be so easily daunted, and he laid about him with such hearty goodwill, cuffing this man and pushing that, strapping a buckle here and taking a link in there, that the chaise was ready in a much shorter time than could reasonably have been expected under so many difficulties. They resumed their journey, and certainly the prospect before them was by no means encouraging. The stage was 15 miles long, the night was dark, the wind high, and the rain pouring in torrents. It was impossible to make any great way against such obstacles united. It was hard upon 1 o'clock already, and nearly 2 hours were consumed in getting to the end of the stage. Here, however, an object presented itself which rekindled their hopes, and reanimated their drooping spirits. "When did this chaise come in?" cried old Wardle, leaping out of his own vehicle, and pointing to the one covered with wet mud which was standing in the yard. "Not an hour ago, sir," replied the hostler, to whom the question was addressed. "Lady and gentleman?" inquired Wardle, almost breathless with impatience. "Yes, sir." "Tall gentleman, dress coat, long legs, thin body?" "Yes, sir." "Elderly lady, thin face, rather skinny, eh?" "Yes, sir." "By heavens, it's them, Pickwick!" exclaimed the old gentleman. "By heavens, it's them, Pickwick!" exclaimed the old gentleman. "Would have been here before," said the hostler, "but they broke a trace." "'Tis them!" said Wardle. "It is, by Jove! Chase and fall instantly! We shall catch them yet!" "'Tis them!" said Wardle. "It is, by Jove! Chase and fall instantly! We shall catch them yet, before they reach the next stage! A guinea apiece, boys! Be alive there! Bustle about! There's good fellows!" And with such admonitions as these, the old gentleman ran up and down the yard, and bustled to and fro in a state of excitement which communicated itself to Pickwick also, and under the influence of which that gentleman got himself into complicated entanglements with harness, and mixed up with horses and wheels of chaises in the most surprising manner, firmly believing that by doing so he was materially forwarding the preparations for their resuming their journey. Jump in!" cried old Wardle, climbing into the chaise, pulling up the steps, and slamming the door after him. "Come along, make haste!" And before Mr. Pickwick knew precisely what he was about, he felt himself forced in at the other door by one pull from the old gentleman and one push from the hostler, and off they were again. "Ah, we are moving now," said the old gentleman exultingly. They were, indeed, as was sufficiently testified to Mr. Pickwick by his constant collisions either with the hard woodwork of the chaise or the body of his companion. "Hold up!" said the stout old Mr. Wardle, as Mr. Pickwick dived head foremost into his capacious waistcoat. "I never did feel such a jolting in my life," said Mr. Pickwick. "Never mind," replied his companion. "It'll soon be over. Steady, steady." Mr. Pickwick planted himself into his own corner as firmly as he could, and on whirled the chaise, faster than ever. They had travelled in this way about 3 miles, when Mr. Wardle, who had been looking out of the window for 2 or 3 minutes, suddenly drew in his face, covered with splashes, and exclaimed in breathless eagerness, "Here they are!" Mr. Pickwick thrust his head out of his window. Yes, there was a chaise and 4, a short distance before them, dashing along at full gallop. Go on!" almost shrieked the old gentleman. "2 guineas apiece, boys! Don't let 'em gain on us! Keep it up! The horses in their first chase started on at their utmost speed, and those in Mr. Wardle's galloped furiously behind them. "I see his head!" exclaimed the choleric old man. "Damn me, I see his head!" "So do I," said Mr. Pickwick. "That's he." Mr. Pickwick was not mistaken. The countenance of Mr. Jingle, completely coated with the mud thrown up by the wheels, was plainly discernible at the window of his chaise, and the motion of his arm, which he was waving violently toward the postilions, denoted that he was encouraging them to increased exertion. The interest was intense. Fields, trees, and hedges seemed to rush past them with the velocity of a whirlwind, so rapidly was the pace at which they tore along. They were close by the side of their first chaise. Jingle's voice could be plainly heard, even above the din of the wheels, urging on the boys. Old Mr. Wardle foamed with rage and excitement. He roared out scoundrels and villains by the dozens, clenched his fist, and shook it expressively at the object of his indignation. But Mr. Jingle only answered with a contemptuous smile, and replied to his menaces by a shout of triumph as his horses, answering the increased application of whip and spur, broke into a faster gallop, and left the pursuers behind. Mr. Pickwick had just drawn in his head, and Mr. Wardle, exhausted with shouting, had done the same, when a tremendous jolt threw them forward against the front of the vehicle. There was a sudden bump, a loud crash, away rolled a wheel, and over went the chaise. After a very few seconds of bewilderment and confusion, in which nothing but the plunging of horses and the breaking of glass could be made out, Mr. Pickwick felt himself violently pulled out from among the ruins of the chaise, and as soon as he had gained his feet and extricated his head from the skirts of his greatcoat, which materially impeded the usefulness of his spectacles, the full disaster of the case met his view. Old Mr. Wardle, without a hat, and his clothes torn in several places, stood by his side, and the fragments of the chaise lay scattered at their feet. The postboys, who had succeeded in cutting the traces, were standing disfigured with mud and disordered by hard riding by the horses' heads. About 100 yards in advance was the other chaise, which had pulled up upon hearing the crash. The postilions, each with a broad grin convulsing his countenance, were viewing the adverse party from their saddles, and Mr. Jingle was contemplating the wreck from the coach window with evident satisfaction. The day was just breaking, and the whole scene was rendered perfectly visible by the grey light of the morning. "Hello!" shouted the shameless Jingle. "Anybody damaged? Elderly gentlemen. No light weights. Dangerous work. Very." "You're a rascal!" roared Wardle. "Ha ha!" replied Jingle, and then he added, with a knowing wink and a jerk of the thumb towards the interior of the chaise, "I say, she's very well. Desires her compliments. Begs you won't trouble yourself. Love to Tuppy. Won't you get up behind? Drive on, boys." The postilions resumed their proper attitudes, and away rattled the chaise, Mr. Jingle fluttering in derision a white handkerchief from the coach window. Nothing in the whole adventure, not even the upset, had disturbed the calm and equable current of Mr. Pickwick's temper. The villainy, however, which could first borrow money of his faithful follower, and then abbreviate his name to Tuppy, was more than he could patiently bear. He drew his breath hard, and colored up to the very tips of his spectacles, as he said, slowly and emphatically, "If ever I meet that man again, I'll—" Yes, interrupted Wardle. That's all very well. But while we stand talking here, they'll get their license and be married in London." Mr. Pickwick paused, bottled up his vengeance, and corked it down. "How far is it to the next stage?" inquired Mr. Wardle of one of the boys. 6 mile, ain't it, Tom?" "Rather better nor 6 miles, sir." "Can't be helped," said Wardle. "We must walk it, Pickwick." "No help for it," replied that truly great man. So sending forward one of the boys on horseback to procure a fresh chaise and horses, and leaving the other behind to take care of the broken one, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle set manfully forward on the walk, first tying their shawls round their necks, and slouching down their hats to escape as much as possible from the deluge of rain, which, after a slight cessation, had again begun to pour heavily down. Chapter 10. Clearing up all doubts, if any existed, of the disinterestedness of Mr. Jingle's character. There are in London several old inns, once the headquarters of celebrated coaches in the days when coaches performed their journeys in a graver and more solemn manner than they do in these times, but which have now degenerated into little more than the abiding and booking places of country wagons. The reader would look in vain for any of these ancient hostelries among the golden crosses and bull and mouths which rear their stately fronts in the improved streets of London. If he would light upon any of these old places, he must direct his steps to the obscurer quarters of the town, and there, in some secluded nooks, he will find several still standing with a kind of gloomy sturdiness amidst the modern innovations which surround them. In the Borough especially, there still remain some half-dozen old inns, which have preserved their external features unchanged, and which have escaped alike the rage for public improvement and the encroachments of private speculation. Great, rambling, queer old places they are, with galleries and passages and staircases wide enough and antiquated enough to furnish materials for 100 ghost stories, supposing we should ever be reduced to the lamentable necessity of inventing any, and that the world should exist long enough to exhaust the innumerable veracious legends connected with Old London Bridge and its adjacent neighbourhood on the Surrey side. It was in the yard of one of these inns, of no less celebrated a one than the White Hart, that a man was busily employed in brushing the dirt off a pair of boots, early on the morning succeeding the events narrated in the last chapter. He was habited in a coarse striped waistcoat, with black calico sleeves and blue glass buttons, drab breeches and leggings. A bright red handkerchief was wound in a very loose and unstudied style round his neck, and an old white hat was carelessly thrown on one side of his head. There were 2 rows of boots before him, one cleaned and the other dirty, and at every addition he made to the clean row, he paused from his work and contemplated its results with evident satisfaction. The yard presented none of that bustle and activity which are the usual characteristics of a large coach inn. 3 or 4 lumbering wagons, each with a pile of goods beneath its ample canopy, about the height of the second-floor window of an ordinary house, were stowed away beneath a lofty roof which extended over one end of the yard, and another, which was probably to commence its journey that morning, was drawn out into the open space. A double tier of bedroom galleries, with old clumsy balustrades, ran round 2 sides of the straggling area, and a double row of bells to correspond, sheltered from the weather by a little sloping roof, hung over the door leading to the bar and coffee-room. 2 or 3 gigs and chaise carts were wheeled up under different little sheds and penthouses, and the occasional heavy tread of a cart-horse or rattling of a chain at the further end of the yard announced to anybody who cared about the matter that the stable lay in that direction. When we add that a few boys in smock frocks were lying asleep on heavy packages, wool packs, and other articles that were scattered about on heaps of straw, we have described as fully as need be the general appearance of the yard of the White Hart Inn, High Street, Borough, on the particular morning in question. A loud ringing of one of the bells was followed by the appearance of a smart chambermaid in the upper sleeping gallery, who, after tapping at one of the doors and receiving a request from within, called over the balustrades, "Sam!" "Hello," replied the man with the white hat. "Number 22 wants his boots." "Ask number 22 whether he'll have 'em now or wait till he gets 'em." "Come, don't be a fool, Sam," said the girl coaxingly. "The gentleman wants his boots directly." "Well, you are a nice young woman for a musical party, you are," said the boot cleaner. "Look at these here boots. 11 pair of boots, and one shoe as belongs to number 6, with a wooden leg. The 11 boots is to be called at 8:30, and the shoe at 9. Who's number 22? That's to put all the others out. No, regular rotation, as Jack Ketch said when he tied the men up. Sorry to keep you waiting, sir, but I'll attend to you directly." Saying which, the man in the white hat set to work upon a top boot with increased assiduity. There was another loud ring, and the bustling old landlady of the White Hart made her appearance in the opposite gallery. "Sam," cried the landlady, "who's that lazy, idle... Why, Sam, oh, there you are. Why don't you answer?" "Wouldn't be genteel to answer till you're done talking," replied Sam gruffly. "Here, clean them shoes for number 17 directly, and take them to private sitting room number 5, first floor." The landlady flung a pair of ladies' shoes into the yard and bustled away. "Number 5, said Sam as he picked up the shoes, and taking a piece of chalk from his pocket, made a memorandum of their destination on the soles. "Ladies' shoes in a private sitting room? I suppose she didn't come in the wagon?" She came in early this morning, cried the girl, who was still leaning over the railing of the gallery, with a gentleman in a hackney coach, and it's him as wants his boots, and you'd better do 'em, and that's all about it. Why didn't you say so before? Said Sam, with great indignation, singling out the boots in question from the heap before him. For all I knowed, he was one of the regular threepennies. Private room, and a lady too. If he's anything of a gentleman, he's worth a shilling a day, let alone the errands. Stimulated by this inspiring reflection, Mr. Samuel brushed away with such a hearty goodwill that in a few minutes the boots and shoes, with a polish which would have struck envy to the soul of the amiable Mr. Warren, for they used Day and Martin at the White Hart, had arrived at the door of number 5. "Come in," said a man's voice, in reply to Sam's rap at the door. Sam made his best bow and stepped into the presence of a lady and gentleman seated at breakfast. Having officiously deposited the gentleman's boots right and left at his feet, and the lady's shoes right and left at hers, he backed towards the door. "Boots," said the gentleman. "Sure," said Sam, closing the door and keeping his hand on the knob of the lock. "Do you know, what's the name? Doctor's Commons." "Yes, sir." "Where is it?" "Past churchyard, sir. Low archway on the carriage side, booksellers at one corner, hotel on the other, and 2 porters in the middle as touts for licenses." "Touts for licenses?" said the gentleman. "Touts for licenses," replied Sam. 2 coves in white aprons, touches their hats when you walk in. License, sir, license. Queer sort, them. And their masters, too, sir. Old Bailey Proctors, and no mistake." "What do they do?" inquired the gentleman. "Do? You, sir. That ain't the worst on it, neither. They puts things into old gentlemen's heads as they never dreamed of. My father, sir, was a coachman, a widower he was, and fat enough for anything. Uncommon fat, to be sure. His missus dies, and leaves him £400. Down he goes to the Commons to see the lawyer and draw the blood. Very smart. Top boots on, nosegay in his buttonhole, broad-brimmed tail, green shawl, quite the gentleman. Goes through the archway, thinking how he wouldn't waste the money. Up comes the touter, touches his hat. License, sir, license. What's that? Says my father. License, sir, says he. What license? Says my father. Marriage license, says the touter. Dash my visket, says the father. I never thought of that. I think you want one, sir, said the touter. My father pulls up and thinks of it. No, says he. Damn me, I'm too old. Besides, I'm a many sizes too large, says he. Not a bit on it, sir, says the touter. Think not, says my father. I'm sure not, says he. We married a gentleman twice your size last Monday. Did you, though? Said my father. To be sure if he did, says the touter. You're a babby to him. This way, sir, this way. And sure enough, my father walks arter him like a tame monkey behind a organ into a little back office where a feller sat among dirty papers and tin boxes, making believe he was busy. Pray take a seat while I makes out the affidavit, sir, says the lawyer. Thank you, sir, says my father. And down he sat and stared with all his eyes and his mouth wide open at the names on the boxes. What's your name, sir, says the lawyer. Tony Weller, says my father. Parish, says the lawyer. Belle Savage, says my father. For he stopped there when he drove up, and he knowed nothing about parishes, he didn't. And what's the lady's name, says the lawyer. My father was struck Oliver Heap. Blessed if I know, says he. Not know, says the lawyer. No more you do, says my father. Can't I put in that afterwards? Impossible, says the lawyer. Very well, says my father. After he'd thought a moment, put down Mrs. Clock. What clock? Says the lawyer, dipping his pen in the ink. Susan Clock, Marcus O'Granby, Dorking, says my father. She'll have me if I ask her, I dare say. I never said nothing to her, but she'll have me, I know. The licence was made out, and she did have him, and what's more, she's got him now. And I never had any of the £400, worse luck. Beg your pardon, sir, said Sam, when he had concluded. But when I gets on this here grievance, I runs on like a new barrow with the veil greased. Having said which, and having paused for an instant to see whether he was wanted for anything more, Sam left the room. 9:30, just the time, off at once, said the gentleman, whom we need hardly introduce as Mr. Jingle. Time for what? Said the spinster aunt coquettishly. License, dearest of angels. Give notice at the church. Call you mine tomorrow, said Mr. Jingle, and he squeezed the spinster aunt's hand. The license, said Rachel, blushing. The license, repeated Mr. Jingle. And hurry, post haste for license, and hurry ding dong I come back. How you run on, said Rachel. Run on, nothing to the hours, days, weeks, months, years, when we're united. Run on, they'll fly on, bolt, missile, steam engine, thousands of horsepower, nothing to it. Can't we be married before tomorrow morning? Inquired Rachel. Impossible, can't be. Notice at the church. Leave the license today. Ceremony come off tomorrow. I am so terrified lest my brother should discover us, said Rachel. Discover? Nonsense. Too much shaken by the breakdown. Besides, extreme caution. Gave up the post-chaise. Walked on. Took a hackney coach. Came to the borough. Last place in the world that he'd look in. Ha-ha! Capital notion, that. Very. Don't be long, said the spinster affectionately, as Mr. Jingle stuck the pinched-up hat on his head. "Long way from you, cruel charmer," and Mr. Jingle skipped playfully up to the spinster aunt, imprinted a chaste kiss upon her lips, and danced out of the room. "Dear man," said the spinster, as the door closed after him. "Rum, old girl," said Mr. Jingle, as he walked down the passage. It is painful to reflect upon the perfidy of our species, and we will not, therefore, pursue the thread of Mr. Jingle's meditations as he wended his way to Doctors' Commons. It will be sufficient for our purpose to relate that, escaping the snares of the dragons in white aprons, who guard the entrance to that enchanted region, he reached the Vicar General's office in safety, and having procured a highly flattering address on parchment from the Archbishop of Canterbury to his trusty and well-beloved Alfred Jingle and Rachel Wardle greeting, he carefully deposited the mystic document in his pocket, and retraced his steps in triumph to the Borough. He was yet on his way to the White Hart, when 2 plump gentlemen and 1 thin one entered the yard and looked round in search of some authorized person of whom they could make a few inquiries. Mr. Samuel Weller happened to be at that moment engaged in burnishing a pair of painted tops, the personal property of a farmer, who was refreshing himself with a slight lunch of 2 or 3 pounds of cold beef and a pot or 2 of porter after the fatigues of the Borough market, and to him the thin gentleman straightway advanced. "My friend," said the thin gentleman. "You're one of the advice gratis order," thought Sam, "or you wouldn't be so very fond of me all at once." But he only said, "Well, sir?" "My friend," said the thin gentleman with a conciliatory hem, "have you got many people stopping here now? Pretty busy, eh?" Sam stole a look at the inquirer. He was a little high-dried man, with a dark, squeezed-up face, and small, restless black eyes that kept winking and twinkling on each side of his little inquisitive nose, as if they were playing a perpetual game of bo-peep with that feature. He was dressed in all black, with boots as shiny as his eyes, a low white neckcloth, and a clean shirt with a frill to it. A gold watch chain and seals depended from his fob. He carried his black kid gloves in his hands, not on them, and as he spoke, thrust his wrists beneath his coat-tails with the air of a man who was in the habit of propounding some regular posers. "Pretty busy, eh?" said the little man. "Oh, very well, sir," replied Sam. "We shan't be bankrupts, and we shan't make our fortunes. We eat shall buy on mutton without capers, and don't give a horseradish when we can get beef." "Ah," said the little man, "you're a wag, ain't you?" "My eldest brother was troubled with that complaint," said Sam. "It might be catching. I used to sleep with him." "This is a curious old house of yours," said the little man, looking round him. "If you'd sent word you was a-comin', we'd have had it repaired," replied the imperturbable Sam. The little man seemed rather baffled by these several repulses, and a short consultation took place between him and the 2 plump gentlemen. At its conclusion, the little man took a pinch of snuff from an oblong silver box, and was apparently on the point of renewing the conversation, when one of the plump gentlemen, who, in addition to a benevolent countenance, possessed a pair of spectacles and a pair of black gaiters, interfered. "The fact of the matter is," said the benevolent gentleman, "that my friend here," pointing to the other plump gentleman, "will give you half a guinea if you'll answer 1 or 2... "Now, my dear sir," said the little man, "pray allow me. My dear sir, the very first principle to be observed in these cases is this. If you place a matter in the hands of a professional man, you must in no way interfere in the progress of the business. You must repose implicit confidence in him. Really, Mr. He turned to the other plump gentleman and said, "I forgot your friend's name." "Pickwick," said Mr. Wardle, for it was no other than that jolly personage. "Ah, Pickwick. Really, Mr. Pickwick, my dear sir. Excuse me, I shall be happy to receive any private suggestions of yours as amicus curiae, but you must see the impropriety of your interfering with my conduct in this case with such an ad captandum argument as the offer of half a guinea. Really, my dear sir, really." And the little man took an argumentative pinch of snuff and looked very profound. "My only wish, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, "was to bring this very unpleasant matter to as speedy a close as possible." Quite right," said the little man. "With which view," continued Mr. Pickwick, "I made use of the argument which my experience of men has taught me is the most likely to succeed in any case." Aye," said the little man. Very good, indeed. But you should have suggested it to me. My dear sir, I am quite certain you cannot be ignorant of the extent of confidence which must be placed in professional men. If any authority can be necessary on such a point, my dear sir, let me refer you to the well-known case in Balmerlone—" "Never mind George Bonville," interrupted Sam, who had remained a wondering listener during this short colloquy. "Everybody knows what sort of case his was. though it's always been my opinion, mind you, that the young woman deserved scragging a precious sight more than he did. Howsoever, that's neither here nor there. You want me to accept half a guinea. Very well, I'm agreeable. I can't say no fairer than that, can I, sir? Mr. Pickwick smiled. Then the next question is, what the devil do you want with me? As the man said when he saved the ghost. We want to know, said Mr. Wardle. Now, my dear sir, interposed the busy little man. Mr. Wardle shrugged his shoulders and was silent. We want to know, said the little man solemnly, and we ask the question of you, in order that we may not awaken apprehensions inside. We want to know who you've got in this house at present. Who there is in the house, said Sam, in whose mind the inmates were always represented by that particular article of their costume which came under his immediate superintendence. There's a wooden leg in number 6. There's a pair of Essens in 13. There's 2 pair of valves in the commercial. These here painted tops in the snuggery inside the bar. And 5 more tops in the coffee room. Nothing more, said the little man. Stop a bit, replied Sam, suddenly recollecting himself. Yes, there's a pair of Wellingtons, a good deal worn, and a pair of ladies' shoes in number 5. What sort of shoes? Hastily inquired Wardle, who, together with Mr. Pickwick, had been lost in bewilderment at the singular catalogue of visitors. Country make, replied Sam. Any maker's name? Brown. Whereof? Muggleton. It is them! Exclaimed Wardle. By heavens, we've found them! Hush! Said Sam. The Wellingtons have gone to Doctor's Commons. No, said the little man. Yes, for a license. We're in time, exclaimed Wardle. Show us the room. Not a moment is to be lost. Pray, my dear sir, pray, said the little man. Caution, caution. He drew from his pocket a red silk purse, and looked very hard at Sam as he drew out a sovereign. Sam grinned expressively. Show us into the room at once, without announcing us, said the little man, and it's yours. Sam threw the painted tops into a corner, and led the way through a dark passage and up a wide staircase. He paused at the end of a second passage, and held out his hand. Here it is, whispered the attorney, as he deposited the money in the hand of their guide. The man stepped forward for a few paces, followed by the 2 friends and their legal adviser. He stopped at a door. Is this the room? Murmured the little gentleman. Sam nodded assent. Old Wardle opened the door, and the whole 3 walked into the room just as Mr. Jingle, who had that moment returned, had produced the license to the spinster aunt. The spinster uttered a loud shriek, and, throwing herself in a chair, covered her face with her hands. Mr. Jingle crumpled up the license and thrust it into his coat pocket. The unwelcome visitors advanced into the middle of the room. You are a nice rascal, aren't you? Exclaimed Wardle, breathless with passion. My dear sir, said the little man, laying his hat on the table. Pray consider, pray. Scandalum magnatum. Defamation of character. Action for damages. Calm yourself, my dear sir, pray. How dare you drag my sister from my house? Said the old man. Aye, very good, said the little gentleman. You may ask that. How dare you, sir? Sir? Who the devil are you? Inquired Mr. Jingle, in so fierce a tone that the little gentleman involuntarily fell back a step or 2. Who is he, you scoundrel? Interposed Wardle. He's my lawyer, Mr. Perker, of Gray's Inn. Perker, I'll have this fellow prosecuted, indicted. Damn me, I'll ruin him! And you, continued Mr. Wardle, turning abruptly round to his sister. You, Rachel, at a time of life when you ought to know better. What do you mean by running away with a vagabond, disgracing your family, and making yourself miserable? Get on your bonnet and come back. Call the hackney coach there, directly, and bring this lady's bill, do you hear? Do you hear? Certainly, sir, replied Sam, who had answered Wardle's violent ringing of the bell with a degree of celerity which must have appeared marvelous to anybody who didn't know that his eye had been applied to the outside of the keyhole during the whole interview. Get on your bonnet, repeated Wardle. Do nothing of the kind, said Jingle. Leave the room, sir. No business here. Lady's free to act as she pleases. More than 1 in 20. More than 1 in 20? Ejaculated Wardle contemptuously. More than 1 in 40? I ain't, said the spinster aunt, her indignation getting the better of her determination to faint. You are, replied Wardle. You're 50 if you're an hour. Here the spinster aunt uttered a loud shriek and became senseless. A glass of water, said the humane Mr. Pickwick, summoning the landlady. A glass of water, said the passionate Wardle. Bring a bucket, and I'll throw it all over her. It'll do her good, and she richly deserves it. Oh, you brute, ejaculated the kind-hearted landlady. Poor dear. And with sundry ejaculations of, Come now, there's a dear, drink a little of this, it'll do you good, don't give way so, there's a love, etc., and etc., the landlady, assisted by a chambermaid, proceeded to vinegar the forehead, beat the hands, titillate the nose, and unlace the stays of the spinster aunt, and to administer such other restoratives as are usually applied by compassionate females to ladies who are endeavoring to ferment themselves into hysterics. "Coach is ready, sir," said Sam, appearing at the door. "Come along," cried Wardle. "I'll carry her downstairs." At this proposition, the hysterics came on with redoubled violence. The landlady was about to enter a very violent protest against this proceeding, and had already given vent to an indignant inquiry whether Mr. Wardle considered himself a lord of the creation, when Mr. Jingle imposed. "Boots," said he, "get me an officer." "Stay, said little Mr. Perker. "Consider, sir, consider." "I'll not consider," replied Jingle. "She is her own mistress. See who dares take her away, unless she wishes it." "I won't be taken away," murmured the spinster aunt. "I don't wish it." Here there was a frightful relapse. "My dear sir," said the little man in a low tone, taking Mr. Wardle and Mr. Pickwick apart. "My dear sir, we're in a very awkward situation. It's a distressing case. Very. I never knew one more so. But really, my dear sir, really we have no power to control this lady's actions. I warned you before we came, my dear sir, that there was nothing to look to but a compromise." There was a short pause. "What kind of compromise would you recommend?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Why, my dear sir, our friend's in an unpleasant position. Very much so. We must be content to suffer some pecuniary loss." "I'll suffer any, rather than submit to this disgrace, and let her, fool as she is, be made miserable for life," said Wardle. "I rather think it can be done," said the bustling little man. "Mr. Jingle, will you step with us into the next room for a moment?" Mr. Jingle assented, and the quartet walked into an empty apartment. "Now, sir," said the little man, as he carefully closed the door, "is there no way of accommodating this matter? Step this way, sir, for a moment. Into this window, sir, where we can be alone. There, sir, there. Pray sit down, sir. Now, my dear sir, between you and I, we know very well, my dear sir, that you have run off with this lady for the sake of her money. Don't frown, sir, don't frown. I say between you and I, we know it. We are both men of the world, and we know very well that our friends here are not, eh?" Mr. Jingle's face gradually relaxed, and something distantly resembling a wink quivered for an instant in his left eye. very good," said the little man, observing the impression he had made. "Now the fact is, that beyond a few hundreds, the lady has little or nothing to the death of her mother. Fine old lady, my dear sir." "Old," said Mr. Jingle, briefly but emphatically. "Why, yes," said the attorney, with a slight cough. "You're right, my dear sir. She is rather old. She comes of an old family, though, my dear sir. Old in every sense of the word. The founder of that family came into Kent when Julius Caesar invaded Britain. Only one member of it since, who hasn't lived to 85, and he was beheaded by one of the Henrys. The old lady is not 73 now, my dear sir." The little man paused and took a pinch of snuff. "Well?" cried Mr. Jingle. "Well, my dear sir, you don't take snuff? Ah, so much the better. Expensive habit. Well, my dear sir, you're a fine young man, man of the world, able to push your fortune if you had capital, eh?" "Well?" said Mr. Jingle again. "Do you comprehend me?" "Not quite." "Don't you think, now, my dear sir, I put it to you, don't you think that £50 and liberty would be better than Miss Wardle and expectation?" "Won't do. Not half enough," said Mr. Jingle, rising. Nay, my dear sir," remonstrated the little attorney, seizing him by the button. "Good round sum. A man like you could treble it in no time. Great deal to be done with £50, my dear sir." "More to be done with 150, replied Mr. Jingle, coolly. "Well, my dear sir, we won't waste time in splitting straws," resumed the little man. Say 70. "Won't do," said Mr. Jingle. "Don't go away, my dear sir. Pray don't hurry," said the little man. 80. Come, I'll write you a cheque at once." "Won't do," said Mr. Jingle. "Well, my dear sir, well," said the little man, still detaining him. "Just tell me what will do." "Expensive affair," said Mr. Jingle. "Money out of pocket. Posting £9. License 3. That's 12. Compensation 112. Breach of honour and loss of the lady." "Yes, my dear sir, yes," said the little man, with a knowing look. "Never mind the last two items. That's 112. Say 100. Come. And 20, said Mr. Jingle. Come, I'll write you a cheque," said the little man, and down he sat at the table for that purpose. "I'll make it payable the day after tomorrow," said the little man, with a look towards Mr. Wardle, "and we can get the lady away meanwhile." Mr. Wardle suddenly nodded assent. 100, said the little man. "And 20, said Mr. Jingle. "My dear sir," remonstrated the little man. "Give it him," interposed Mr. Wardle, "and let him go." The check was written by the little gentleman and pocketed by Mr. Jingle. "Now, leave this house instantly," said Wardle, starting up. "My dear sir," urged the little man. "And mind," said Mr. Wardle, "that nothing should have induced me to make this compromise, not even a regard for my family, if I had not known that the moment you got any money in that pocket of yours, you'd go to the devil faster, if possible, than you would without it." "My dear sir," urged the little man again. "Be quiet, Perker," resumed Wardle. "Leave the room, sir." "Off directly," said the unabashed Jingle. "Bye-bye, Pickwick." If any dispassionate spectator could have beheld the countenance of the illustrious man, whose name forms the leading feature of the title of this work, during the latter part of this conversation, he would have been almost induced to wonder that the indignant fire which flashed from his eyes did not melt the glasses of his spectacles. So majestic was his wrath. His nostrils dilated, and his fists clenched involuntarily, as he heard himself addressed by the villain. But he restrained himself again. He did not pulverize him. "Here," continued the hardened traitor, tossing the license at Mr. Pickwick's feet. "Get the name altered. Take home the lady. Do for Tabby." Mr. Pickwick was a philosopher, but philosophers are only men in armor after all. The shaft had reached him, penetrated through his philosophical harness to his very heart. In the frenzy of his rage, he hurled the inkstand madly forward and followed it up himself. But Mr. Jingle had disappeared, and he found himself caught in the arms of Sam. "Hello," said the eccentric functionary. "Furniture's tip where you come from. Self-acting ink, there. It's wrote your mark upon the wall, old gentleman. Hold still, sir. What's the use of running arter a man that has made his lucky, and gone to the other end of the borough by this time?" Mr. Pickwick's mind, like those of all truly great men, was open to conviction. He was a quick and powerful reasoner, and a moment's reflection sufficed to remind him of the impotency of his rage. It subsided as quickly as it had been roused. He panted for breath, and looked benignantly round upon his friends. Shall we tell the lamentations that ensued when Miss Wardle found herself deserted by the faithless Jingle? Shall we extract Mr. Pickwick's masterly description of that heart-rending scene? His notebook, blotted with the tears of sympathizing humanity, lies open before us. One word, and it is in the printer's hands. But no, we will be resolute. We will not wring the public bosom with the delineation of such suffering. Slowly and sadly did the two friends and the deserted lady return next day in the Muggleton heavy coach. Dimly and darkly had the sombre shadow of a summer's night fallen upon all around, when they again reached Dingley Dell, and stood within the entrance to Manor Farm.